Hello, so let's go over some expressions. So the first thing I want to go over is absolute value. So do you guys remember what absolute value is? Do you remember the definition? Nobody? Okay, so the absolute value is the distance from zero. Distance from zero. So if I was to run backwards, and let's say I ran an entire block backwards. If I was running backwards, say 1 block, we might say -1 block to show that I was running backwards. If I was running forwards, I might say +1 block to show that I was running forwards. But when we're talking about absolute value, we're talking about just how far you ran or how far you dug a hole. I don't care that I ran backwards. I ran 1 block. So the fact that I ran backwards doesn't matter. So absolute value is just the distance. It doesn't matter whether you're on the positive side or the negative side of zero. They just want to know how far you dug a hole or how far you ran. So they use it a lot in construction and other things when we're talking about distance of something. So when they say the absolute value of 4, and these are the symbols for absolute value. So these straight bars, they're not parentheses. They are straight bars, and you read those symbols as the absolute value of 4. So they want to know how far is 4 from 0. So how far is 4 from the 0 on the number line? Isn't it 4 units, right? Isn't it 1, 2, 3, 4 units from 0? So we say 4 units. And a lot of times we drop out the word units and we just say it's 4, right? It's 4 units from 0. Number 2, what is the absolute value? So these straight lines, we call them bars. Absolute value bars are straight lines. They're not parentheses. So when you're making your absolute value symbols, make sure you make them straight bars and not parentheses. So this is read the absolute value of -3. And the absolute value of -3 is saying how far is -3 from 0? How far is -3 from 0? Isn't it just 3 units from 0? So we say the answer is 3 units. Or you could just say 3. You don't have to really write the word units in there. So the absolute value is always going to be positive because when you're talking about distance, you're not really saying which side of the number line you are. They're just saying you went 3 miles, whether you went backwards 3 miles or forwards 3 miles. Just like if I dug a hole. If I dug 3 feet in the ground, we would normally say that I did -3 because I went below the ground. If I put 3 feet of dirt above the ground, we would say maybe +3 to show it's above ground versus below the ground. But when we're talking about absolute value, we don't really care whether we're above the ground or below the ground. We just want to know how far from the ground, from 0 is it. So it's just 3. So why don't you pause the tape and take a moment and pause and see if you can do 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I'll come back and show you what we get. Okay, so hopefully you pause the tape. So number 3 says, what's the absolute value of -1? So they want to know how far is -1 from 0. It is 1 unit from 0. Notice in problem number 4, you read that problem as the absolute value of 5 plus the absolute value of -7. So we have to do the absolute values first. So the absolute value of 5 is how far is 5 from 0? It is 5 units. How far is -7 from 0? It is 7 units. And then we're going to add those two together. And 5 plus 7 is then 12. So your final answer should have been 12. And that should have been the work you should have shown. You cannot just have answers. You must show work when there are multiple operations. Notice in problem number 5 that there is a plus sign inside the absolute value, where notice here the absolute value was in between, or the addition was in between the absolute value. So notice that here the adding is inside. in the interior of the absolute value bar. So order of operation says we have to do -8 plus 2 first. And I don't know if you remember your adding skills, but -8 plus 2 happens to be a -6. And we'll go into that more later, but the reason why that is you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 negatives and 2 positives. And a positive with a negative charge makes a 0 charge, so that's why this ends up being -6 as our final answer. We'll go into that more later. And then the absolute value, now we can take the absolute value, because we had to do what, we had to add those two operations, -8 plus 2 first. And then we could take the absolute value of -6, which is how far is -6 from 0? It is 6 units from 0. So that's what your work should have been. Number 6, what's the absolute value of 5? Means how far is 5 from 0? It is 5 units. And then remember, you should know that anytime you have a number next to an operation and there is nothing there, remember that means multiply. So that means 2 times the absolute value of -3. So we're going to rewrite 2 times, and then we have to do how far is -3 from 0? It is 3 units from 0, and then we can multiply 2 times 3 is 6. Okay, so let's look at square roots. Again, these are things that you should already know, so hopefully this is not brand new and you're like, I already know this. Like, it should be review. So remember, number 1 says the square root of 4. So we're looking for what number times itself is 4. So what number could you multiply by where it's the same number that would equal 4? And you would say, well, isn't 2 times 2 4? So that's why the square root of 4 is 2. So what number is the same number that you could multiply by that would equal 25? It has to be the same number. Like 4 times 4 is 16. 3 times 3 is 9. 8 times 8 is 64. So it would be 5 times 5. So therefore, the square root of 25 is 5. Square root of 100, I'm going to use a different color because that's not really showing up. So that would be 5. The square root of 100 would be, 6 times 6 is 36. Nope. 7 times 7 is 49. Nope. 8 times 8 is 64. Oh, 10 times 10 is 100. So the square root of 100 is 10. Square root of 9, 2 times 2 is 4. Nope. 3 times 3 is not, yep, 3. Because 3 times 3, right? Because 3 times 3 is 9. Therefore, the square root of 9 is 3. So you guys from middle school should already know your square roots. Like, you should know the square root of 0 is 0, because 0 times 0 is 0. You should know the square root of 1 is 1, because 1 times 1 is 1. Square root of 2, oh, I don't know, IDK. Square root of 3, I don't know, IDK. Square root of 4, oh, that's 2, because 2 times 2 is 4. Square root of 9 is 3, because 3 times 3 is 9. Square root of 16 is 4, because 4 times 4 is 16. Square root of 25 is 5. Square root of 36 is 6. Square root of 49 is 7, etc. You should know those ones. These ones we don't know. We could try a calculator and use a calculator to approximate, and we can spend some time going over that another day. But these are the ones that we should know, and we should know all the way up through 144, because the square root of 144 is 12 times 12, so that'd be 12. Okay, so you try the next set of problems and see if you can evaluate those expressions, knowing what you know about square roots. So go ahead and put it on pause, do the problems, and then come back and let's see how you did. Okay, so did you say the square root of 1 is 1, the square root of 16 is 4, and then we're going to add those together, so that would be 5, and that's what your work should look like. Square root of 49 is 7, because 7 times 7 is 49. Notice the square root symbol goes all the way out to the 1, and there's 80 plus 1 under what we call the radical symbol, or the square root symbol. So we have to add the 80 and the 1 first. So you have to have your square root. 80 plus 1 is 81, is under the square root symbol. Then you can say the square root of 81 is 9, because 9 times 9 is 81. So you have to show these steps. If you just say the answer is 9 and not showing those steps, we're not going to give you full credit. Be careful that you're not leaving out the square root symbol. So some people are just saying 81 and then they're thinking in their head, that's 9. You haven't done the square root part yet. You've only done the 80 plus 1 to get the 81. So be careful. For square root 64, remember, if there's a number next to a symbol and there's nothing in between it, that implies multiplication. So this means 4 times the square root of 64. And the square root of 64 is 8, because 8 times 8 is 64, and 4 times 8 is 32. So those are a few little things that we wanted to cover that you should already know. And now let's go to more complicated expressions. So here are some algebraic expressions or variable expressions where you have to substitute the variables with what values it says to substitute. So basically A and B are just placeholders. So they want you to replace A. So wherever you see an A, they want you to replace it with 3, and they want you to replace the B with 7. So some kids will say 3, 7. Well, then that looks like 37. That's not correct. Remember, when you have two letters next to each other and there's nothing in between, remember that means multiply. So you either have to show a dot for multiplication, or what I prefer is to show a parentheses for multiplication. You could write 3 and then an X for multiplication. All of those are correct, but in algebra, which we're now in, we don't like to use the X for multiplication because we use X's for a lot of variables. So we like you to either use the dot or when you have it, or use the parentheses to show multiplication. So, and then 3 times 7 is 21. So this is what it should have looked like. So you should have 3 and then use the parentheses for multiplication. So that is 3 times 7, and 3 times 7 is 21. Let's look at number 2. In number 2, we have C is 10 minus the absolute value, and B is being replaced with -6, and then plus, and then A is being replaced with 5. So notice that I replaced A with 5, I replaced B with -6, and I replaced C with 10. That is called the substitution step. So this step is the substitution step. All I did was take out the letters and replace them with the correct numerical values. Now we're going to do order of operations. Order of operations says we're going to have to do the absolute value of -6 first. So we're going to rewrite the 10 and the minus, and then the absolute value of -6 means how far is -6 from 0? It is 6 units from 0, and then plus 5. And now we're going to use order of operations, PEMDAS. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Now, there are no parentheses, there are no exponents. I do not see a multiplication or a division. There's only adding and subtracting. So now we have to do the addition and subtraction in PEMDAS. You would think that you always add before you subtract because the A is first in the word PEMDAS, but that's not true. That is not true. Remember, adding and subtracting is from left to right, whichever of those symbols comes first. So in whichever of these comes first, from left to right. So notice that the subtraction came before the addition, so we must do the 10 subtract 6 first before we do the plus 5. So 10 subtract 6 is 4. Then we can add 4 plus 5 and say 9. And so this is called the tier method, where we're showing the substitution and then one operation at a time until we get our final answer. And that is the expectation, is that you will have nice, neat, organized tier method one step at a time. Okay, number 3. Notice that we're going to replace the B, C, and the A with the values that they say to substitute. Remember, when you have two letters next to each other and there's nothing in between, remember that means multiply. So when I substitute, so it says B is 10 and then times, right, because that means multiply, C is 4. So there I use my parentheses to show multiplication. And then 3 plus A is 2. So this is my substitution step. Notice I have not done any math yet. I just substituted, and that's the expectation. The first step is just you using correct operations and notation and just taking out the letters and replacing them with their numbers appropriately. Now we're going to do the math. So we're going to multiply 10 times 4. We're going to add 3 plus 2, and let's see what we get in the numerator and the denominator. So when you multiply 10 times 4, doesn't that give me 40 in the numerator? And isn't 3 plus 2 give me 5 in the denominator? Now remember, this fraction is also a division bar. So this also means 40 divided by 5. Right? That's what that means. You guys should know that this means 40 divided by 5, and you should know your basic division facts. So you should know that 40 divided by 5 is 8. So your final answer is 8. Number 4. So if we replace all the letters with what they suggest, the numbers they suggest, then our expression would be the square root of 81 plus C is 2. So I'm going to put 2 in parentheses to the third power, because C, this is read C to the third power, or C cubed, and then minus B, and B happens to be 5. So the square root of 81, right? The square root of 81, what number times itself is 81? So 9 times 9 is 81. So the square root of 81 is 9, plus, and then 2 cubed. Remember, 2 to the third power is how you read that, and remember that means 2 times 2 times 2, right? Remember, that's what 2 to the third power means. 2 times 2 times 2. And 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 2 is 8. So 2 to the third power is 8. Now we're going to do PEMDAS. Notice that we did our exponents first and our square roots. Notice how this time addition came first. So this time, since adding came first, we're going to add because it came first. And so 9 plus 8 is 17. And I'm running out of room, so I'm going to move it up here. So that's 17, take away 5, and that is 12. So notice that you have all your steps using the tier method. And let's look at the last problem. The last problem has a square root, and then it says b squared, so I'm going to put a parentheses where the b used to be. I'm going to say 10 squared minus 4 times a times c. Notice I use the parentheses to show multiplication, which you should do as well. I'm going to replace a with 3, and I'm going to replace c with 3 as well. So when I do that, that gives me this expression. So this is the substitution step. Notice I haven't done any math yet. Now I have to do what's underneath the square root symbol by PEMDAS. I got to do the exponents. So 10 squared, remember 10 squared means 10 times 10. So that's 100. And then minus, and now I've got to multiply 4 times 3 times 3. So I have to multiply 4 times 3 times 3. So off to the side of my paper, what is 4 times 3 times 3? Well, I can do 4 times 3 is 12, and 12 times 3 is 36. Or, since it's all multiplication, couldn't I do the 3 times 3 is 9, and then 4 times 9 is 36? Right? Wouldn't that be smarter? So 10 squared is 100, and 4 times 3 times 3 is 36. And again, I'm running out of room, so I'm going to erase this. And then don't forget your square root symbol. Now we have to do the subtraction. So 100 subtract 36 is 64. And then the square root of 64 is 8. So that's what your work should look like for that problem. So I hope this helps you do your homework. You may watch it as many times as you want.